In a lavish hall in Berlin, far from the savannas and kingdoms of Africa, 14 European powers gathered around a map. There were no African leaders present, no tribal chiefs, no emissaries, no voices from the continent itself. Over cigars and diplomacy, they drew borders with rulers and ink, carving up a land they did not own. The Berlin Conference of 1884 wasn't a war. It was a negotiation of conquest. With the stroke of a pen, rivers became boundaries, cultures were split, and centuries of history were overwritten. This was the scramble for Africa, a race for resources, power, and empire. But what were the consequences of dividing a continent without consent? And how does that legacy still echo today? In the final decades of the 19th century, Africa remained to many Europeans a continent of mysteries, a vast expanse of lands only partially mapped, rich in resources, yet largely beyond the control of imperial powers. Though coastal enclaves had long been settled by traders from Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, much of the interior remained the domain of African kingdoms, empires, and confederations whose histories stretched back centuries. It was a world of shifting alliances, vibrant trade routes, and powerful polities such as the Ashanti in West Africa, the Zulu in the south, the Sokoto Caliphate in the Sahel, and Ethiopia in the Horn. Each represented traditions and sovereignties that were about to be tested by forces they could not have foreseen. Europe, meanwhile, was undergoing transformations that would thrust it into Africa with unprecedented aggression. The Industrial Revolution had created new demands for raw materials. Cotton, palm oil, copper, gold, and above all, rubber. Factories in Manchester, Hamburg, and Lyon ran on the lifeblood of resources, and the hunt for secure supplies intensified. At the same time, European national rivalries were sharpening. The unification of Germany in 1871, under Otto von Bismarck, had altered the continental balance of power. Germany was a new industrial titan hungry for influence. France, still stung by defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, sought to rebuild its prestige overseas. Britain, with its global empire, feared rivals encroaching on the lifelines of its trade routes. Belgium, small yet ambitious under King Leopold II, harbored dreams of grandeur that far exceeded its size. The stage was set for competition not just for colonies, but for the very image of national greatness. The rhetoric of this scramble was cloaked in the language of civilizing missions. Missionaries carried with them the conviction that they were saving souls, introducing Christianity to those deemed heathen. Explorers like David Livingstone returned to Europe with tales of dark interiors and noble missions to end the slave trade. But beneath these lofty justifications lay the harder calculus of profit and power. Africa was not to be seen as a continent of sovereign peoples with cultures and rights, but as a vast resource waiting to be parceled. Before 1884, European presence inland was limited. Harsh climates, diseases like malaria, and resistance from African states had all slowed expansion. The introduction of quinine as a prophylactic against malaria, however, altered the balance. So too did new technologies, the Maxim gun, railways, and steamships that could navigate rivers. These innovations gave Europeans unprecedented advantages over African armies and terrain. The economic interests, political rivalries, and technological advances converged into a pressure that demanded some form of continental agreement to prevent Europe from turning Africa into a battlefield of empire. It was Leopold II of Belgium who pushed hardest for this. Having secured exploration rights through Henry Morton Stanley in the Congo Basin, Leopold presented his ambitions as a philanthropic project to open up Africa to trade and civilization. In truth, he sought a personal empire that would enrich him under the guise of humanitarianism. His lobbying found receptive ears in Bismarck, who saw an opportunity to enhance Germany's diplomatic prestige by convening the powers of Europe in Berlin. Thus, in November 1884, representatives of 14 nations gathered in the German capital for what would become known as the Berlin Conference. The conference's premise was deceptively simple: to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa and avoid conflict among imperial rivals. Yet in practice, it amounted to the division of a continent whose people had no seat at the table. No African ruler, chief, or representative was invited. The decisions taken would redraw maps, extinguish sovereignties, and alter destinies without consultation. The image of men in frock coats leaning over maps of Africa, carving borders with pencils and rulers, came to symbolize one of history's most blatant acts of dispossession. For Africa, the prelude to this conference was already marked by encroachments. The French had pressed inland from Senegal, reaching the upper Niger. The British had consolidated control along the Gold Coast and were pushing toward Ashanti lands. In southern Africa, the British and the Boers contested control over territories rich in diamonds and gold. The Portuguese clung to Angola and Mozambique, relics of their once great maritime empire, while Germany eyed territories in southwest and East Africa. Each ambition was a thread pulling tighter on the continent, and Berlin was to be the loom on which they were woven into a grand tapestry of empire. The world before the carving was thus a moment of possibility and peril. African rulers still commanded armies, still levied taxes, still ruled lands according to traditions older than Europe's modern states. But the tide was turning. The dynamics of global capitalism, the rivalry of European nations, and the arrogance of a worldview that denied African sovereignty were converging into a single historical storm. The Berlin Conference would not create the scramble, but it would codify it, accelerate it, and give it the veneer of legality. What followed would be decades of conquest, resistance, and suffering, as lines drawn in Berlin cut through villages, kingdoms, and entire civilizations. The story of the scramble for Africa, then, begins not with Berlin's maps, but with the collision of European hunger and African sovereignty. It is the story of how a continent that had shaped its destiny for millennia was suddenly forced into a system where its voice was silenced, its borders imposed, and its resources consumed by distant capitals. It is the story of how modern imperialism, under the guise of progress, left scars that endure to this day. In the late autumn of 1884, Berlin transformed into a stage upon which the destinies of millions would be silently reshaped. The streets of the German capital bustled with carriages carrying diplomats, ministers, and envoys, all summoned by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to attend what he grandly termed an international conference. The city itself, still radiant from the triumphs of German unification barely 13 years earlier, was determined to show its stature as a new center of European power. Gas lamps glowed on Unter den Linden, and the Reich Chancellery became the crucible of imperial ambition. Bismarck himself had little interest in colonies for Germany. Known as the Iron Chancellor, his genius lay in balancing power within Europe, not in planting flags overseas. Yet he recognized that Germany, unified under Prussian leadership, could not remain absent from the imperial game. By hosting the conference, he positioned himself as the arbiter of global order. The German Empire would appear as the guarantor of peace among rival powers, its prestige elevated without the costs of conquest. For Bismarck, Africa was less a treasure than a tool, a bargaining chip in the larger chessboard of diplomacy. The conference formally opened on November 15, 1884. Around a vast table adorned with green baize and gilded edges sat representatives of 14 nations: Germany, France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and the United States. Never before had so many powers gathered to discuss the fate of a continent whose inhabitants were conspicuously absent. No African king, emir, chief, or scholar received an invitation. The people most affected were voiceless, their lands reduced to lines and colors on European maps. The men present came armed with competing ambitions. Britain, represented by Sir Edward Mallet and Lord Granville, sought to secure its vital trade routes to India and prevent French dominance in West Africa. France, under Jules Ferry's government, pursued an empire stretching across the Sahara into equatorial Africa. Portugal clung to dreams of a rose-colored map connecting Angola and Mozambique across the continent. Leopold II of Belgium, though not personally present, was represented by shrewd envoys who pressed his claims to the Congo Basin under the guise of humanitarian reform. The United States attended in a limited role, echoing its earlier Monroe Doctrine against European expansion in the Americas, but showing little interest in Africa itself. At Bismarck's table, Diplomacy was performed with the elegance of a stage play, but underpinned by ruthless calculation. Treaties, concessions, and spheres of influence were discussed in abstract terms, yet what they meant was the dismemberment of African sovereignties. The language of the proceedings was carefully sanitized. The conference did not speak of conquest, but of freedom of commerce, suppression of slavery, and protection of natives. These phrases, noble in tone, masked the reality that Europe sought resources, markets, and prestige. The conference gave colonial expansion a patina of legality, converting raw greed into international law. Central to the discussions was the Congo Basin. Leopold II, through his International Association of the Congo, presented his domain as a neutral, humanitarian project. He promised free trade, missionary access, and a campaign against the slave trade. Many delegates, eager to prevent rivals from gaining too much power, accepted these assurances. In reality, Leopold was laying the foundation for one of the most brutal regimes in modern history, where forced labor, violence, and terror would extract rubber and ivory at a horrific human cost. Yet in Berlin, cloaked in philanthropy, his claims were recognized. Equally critical was the principle of effective occupation. Proposed by the conference, it stipulated that a European power could only claim sovereignty over an African territory if it had established actual control, administration, forts, or treaties with local rulers. This was intended to prevent mere paper claims and reduce disputes among Europeans. But in practice, it ignited a frenzied race to plant flags, build outposts, and sign coerced treaties across the continent. The ink on the conference documents would become the catalyst for a violent scramble as nations rushed to fulfill the condition of occupation. Bismarck presided with characteristic detachment, ensuring Germany gained colonial footholds without appearing grasping. While he personally doubted the economic value of African colonies, he skillfully used them as diplomatic leverage. Germany secured recognition for territories in Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, East Africa, Tanzania, and Cameroon. For a nation that had entered the colonial race late, it was a significant symbolic gain. France and Britain, meanwhile, eyed each other warily, both determined to prevent the other from achieving continental dominance. The atmosphere of the conference blended formality with quiet ruthlessness. Maps were spread, pens dipped in ink, and voices debated boundaries of rivers and coastlines. Yet behind every demarcation lay villages, families, and centuries-old communities whose lives would be irrevocably disrupted. The men in frock coats spoke in the language of law and progress, but what they enacted was the subjugation of entire civilizations. The outcome of Bismarck's table was the General Act of the Berlin Conference, signed on February 26, 1885. It formalized principles of free trade in the Congo, free navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers, and the doctrine of effective occupation. On paper, it looked like an enlightened agreement to prevent war and promote commerce. In practice, it marked the beginning of Africa's partition. Within 2 decades, almost the entire continent would be carved into colonies, leaving only Ethiopia and Liberia as sovereign states. The Berlin Conference, thus, stands as a paradox. It was hailed in Europe as a triumph of diplomacy, an example of peaceful cooperation among rival powers. But for Africa, it was a silent catastrophe. At no other moment in modern history were the fates of so many decided by so few, with so little regard for those whose voices were silenced. Bismarck's table became the altar upon which African sovereignty was sacrificed, its peoples treated as pawns in a game of empire. The conference ended with toasts, handshakes, and photographs of dignitaries gathered in Berlin. Outside, life in the city went on, oblivious to the consequences. Yet in Africa, the consequences would soon be felt with devastating force. Lines drawn by rulers in Europe would cut across rivers, mountains, and kinship networks, sowing seeds of division that echo into the present. Bismarck may have achieved his diplomatic aims, but at a cost borne by millions far from Berlin. When the delegates of the Berlin Conference leaned over their maps, they were not simply drawing boundaries, they were redrawing the fate of a continent. Africa, with its countless kingdoms, empires, pastoral tribes, and merchant cities, was compressed into sheets of parchment spread across the tables of Europe. The pen strokes of diplomats in Berlin sliced through mountains, rivers, and deserts, disregarding ancient alliances and rivalries. Every line was a bargain, a compromise, or an act of arrogance. The maps themselves were abstractions. Few Europeans had penetrated far into Africa's interior by 1884. Vast regions remained blank spaces, filled in only with vague conjecture or dotted with rivers sketched from hearsay. Yet the conference treated these maps as authoritative. Lines were drawn confidently through territories unseen, governed by rulers unconsulted, lived in by millions unheard. The act of partitioning Africa was not based on knowledge of the continent, but on calculations of power. The idea of effective occupation, adopted in Berlin, turned these lines into instruments of urgency. Each European power now rushed to convert its paper claims into visible presence. Forts were established along rivers, garrisons built near coasts, and treaties, often incomprehensible to their signers, were obtained from local rulers. Chiefs were handed documents in foreign tongues, sometimes exchanged for cloth, beads, or rifles, and told they had ceded sovereignty. In the European imagination, these signatures transformed Africa into a chessboard of colonial legitimacy. France, pursuing its dream of a vast trans-Saharan empire, secured claims stretching from Senegal eastward across the Sahel. Britain, determined to guard its sea route to India, tightened its hold over Egypt and the Suez Canal while expanding along the Niger and southward through modern-day South Africa. Germany, entering the race late, obtained territories in Southwest Africa, East Africa, and Cameroon. Portugal, though weakened, clung to Angola and Mozambique, envisioning a grand corridor across the continent. Italy, a newcomer to colonial ventures, staked claims on the Horn of Africa. The carved map was not just a symbol of European ambition but a blueprint for conflict. The borders drawn in Berlin were jagged, often cutting across ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines. A single tribe might find itself divided between two empires, while rival groups were forced into artificial unity under a colonial administration. The seeds of future strife, civil wars, ethnic tensions, and contested borders were planted in those careless strokes of ink. The continent was reshaped not to reflect its own rhythms, but to suit the desires of distant capitals: London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, Lisbon, and Rome. Cartography became a weapon of empire. The mapmakers, geographers, and surveyors who followed in the wake of the conference were tasked with transforming abstractions into realities. Expeditions were launched to chart rivers, measure coastlines, and document landscapes. These efforts were often accompanied by soldiers and administrators, for the map required enforcement. Where a European line intersected with a resistant people, violence followed. Africa was mapped in blood as much as in ink. The men who carved Africa on paper believed they were imposing order on chaos. They viewed indigenous boundaries as primitive, tribal affiliations as obstacles to progress, and African sovereignty as non-existent. To them, the map was a rational instrument, a means of preventing war among Europeans by regulating the division of spoils. Yet the order they created was an illusion, one that concealed the disorder it inflicted upon Africa itself. Behind the conference's polished diplomacy, competition simmered. France and Britain clashed repeatedly in West Africa, each determined to expand its line further inland. The tension would culminate in the Fashoda incident of 1898, where their forces nearly came to war in Sudan. Germany's acquisitions, though limited compared to Britain and France, marked a bold statement of ambition. Belgium's king, Leopold II, quietly secured recognition of his Congo Free State, which in reality was his personal domain. No monarch in Europe had ever acquired so vast a territory for himself. The act of carving the map also had psychological consequences. Europe began to imagine Africa less as a collection of nations and more as a patchwork of possessions. Newspapers printed color-coded maps, each colony shaded according to its master: red for Britain, blue for France, yellow for Belgium, and so on. To European readers, Africa became an atlas of imperial pride, a symbol of national strength and rivalry. The continent's people were rendered invisible, reduced to statistics and resources. Yet beneath the abstraction, resistance brewed. African rulers did not view their lands as commodities to be traded in Berlin. They would resist, sometimes with diplomacy, often with arms. The Zulu, the Ashanti, the Herero, and countless others would challenge the validity of foreign claims. But the European powers, armed with rifles, artillery, and industrial might, pressed forward. The carved map set the stage for decades of struggle, conquest, and subjugation. The Berlin Conference had promised peace among Europeans, but in Africa it unleashed chaos. By legitimizing territorial claims, it gave license to an era of invasion. The carved map was both prophecy and command. What had been drawn must now be occupied. Within a generation, nearly the entire continent would be under European rule. As the diplomats rolled up their maps and departed Berlin, few paused to consider the enormity of what they had done. They had transformed Africa into an abstraction of lines, treaties, and spheres of influence. But for the millions who lived within those lines, the abstraction would soon take brutal form. What was decided in ink in Berlin would be enforced with iron and fire in Africa. When the Berlin Conference closed in early 1885, the diplomats congratulated themselves on having tamed the chaos of imperial rivalry. In truth, they had only lit a fuse. The doctrine of effective occupation was now law. Claims drawn on paper required proof on the ground. Flags had to be planted, treaties signed, forts built, and garrisons established. The ink of Berlin quickly hardened into steel, gunpowder, and blood. The scramble began in earnest. French officers marched inland from Senegal, following the arteries of the Niger and laying claim to vast stretches of the Sahel. Their blue, white, and red flag was raised in outposts carved from hostile terrain. Britain, determined not to be outpaced, surged forward along the coasts of West Africa, its traders and military units pressing inland toward the Niger Delta and the interior of modern Nigeria. Each advance was driven not by curiosity but by fear that another power might seize the land first. Germany, late to empire but determined to prove itself, dispatched adventurers, soldiers, and merchants into East Africa and the arid expanses of Southwest Africa. Treaties were thrust before bewildered chiefs, often translated poorly or not at all. With signatures or marks obtained, German officials declared vast regions under their protection. In Cameroon and Togoland, trading companies secured footholds that became colonial states. The swiftness of these seizures shocked older powers, who had underestimated Berlin's determination to project influence. Belgium's monarch Leopold II, cloaked in philanthropic rhetoric, unleashed agents into the Congo Basin. They waved the banner of the International African Association, claiming to represent humanitarian progress while, in fact, working for Leopold's private fortune. Villages were coerced into agreements ceding land, and forts rose along the Congo River. By 1885, the Congo Free State, Leopold's personal fiefdom, was recognized. No empire was more ruthless in its pursuit of rubber and ivory, and none would exact a greater human toll. Portugal, one of the earliest European presences on the continent, reasserted its hold on Angola and Mozambique, though with less vigor than its rivals. Its dream of a transcontinental corridor from west to east clashed with British ambitions for a Cape to Cairo dominion. Italy, eager to join the ranks of the great powers, planted its flag in Eritrea and eyed Somalia, setting the stage for future disasters. This race was not measured in months or years, but in days. News of rival claims spurred sudden expeditions, as colonial officers rushed to stake their ground. In one notorious instance, British and German agents raced to hoist their flags in East Africa, each determined to arrive first. Rivers, mountain ranges, and deserts became battlegrounds of cartographic urgency. The map carved in Berlin was being filled with emblems of conquest. Yet what appeared to Europeans as empty spaces were lands of profound human history. Every valley, plain, and forest had its rulers, customs, and rhythms of life. The scramble trampled them. Tribes were divided, rivalry sharpened, and entire communities confronted the sudden arrival of foreign authority. Where persuasion failed, violence followed. Armies equipped with repeating rifles and Maxim guns subdued kingdoms that had withstood centuries of regional conflict. Resistance was often heroic but brutally crushed. For the colonial powers, spectacle mattered. Planting a flag was not merely a ritual. It was a performance of sovereignty, a declaration to rivals and to the world. Ceremonies were staged with trumpets, salutes, and proclamations. Newspapers in Europe eagerly reported these symbolic acts, transforming remote rivers and jungles into points of national pride. A flag in Africa became a headline in London, Paris, or Berlin. The rush for territory also revealed the fragile alliances among the powers. Despite the conference's promise of regulated expansion, disputes erupted constantly. France and Britain quarreled along the Niger. Germany clashed with Britain in East Africa. Belgium's claims in the Congo raised suspicion on all sides. These frictions were contained, for the moment, by diplomacy. But beneath the surface, rivalries simmered, ready to boil into conflict. For Africans, the experience was bewildering. Chiefs who had long traded with Europeans on coastal terms now found themselves declared subjects of distant kings. Some sought to manipulate the newcomers, signing treaties with multiple powers in hopes of playing them against each other. Others resisted outright, leading to wars that scarred the landscape. The Scramble was not simply a European phenomenon. It was a collision of worlds, in which African agency, though constrained, still mattered. The human cost of the race was immediate. Porters were conscripted to haul supplies for expeditions. Villages were raided to provision colonial outposts. Labor was extracted to build roads, forts, and telegraph lines. The Scramble's infrastructure was constructed on African backs. Death from exhaustion, disease, and violence accompanied each advance. To European audiences, maps filled with colored borders symbolized progress. To Africans, they marked the onset of dispossession. By the late 1880s, the transformation was unmistakable. Where once Africa had been a mosaic of independent polities, it was now being quilted into the fabric of European empires. Flags sprouted like weeds, each one a claim of permanence. The speed of this shift astonished observers. Within a single decade, a continent long resistant to European domination was being absorbed into the machinery of empire. The race for territory, set in motion by the Berlin Conference, was not a spontaneous rush but a calculated sprint. Each power sought not only resources but prestige, seeking to outpace rivals and prove itself on the global stage. The Scramble was less about Africa itself and more about Europe, its fears, ambitions, and compulsions. Africa became the canvas on which Europe painted its rivalries, with the lives of millions as the paint. The continent would never be the same. Boundaries hardened, colonial administrations entrenched themselves, and the first phase of European domination unfolded. The flags planted in those frenzied years would endure, their lines fossilized into the borders of modern African states. What was drawn hastily in the 1880s remains, to this day, one of the most enduring legacies of imperial ambition. In the grand halls of Berlin, where the future of Africa was carved with ink and compasses, one truth stood above all others. Not a single African voice was present to shape the destiny of the continent. 21 delegates from 14 European nations gathered around the polished tables of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's palace, their polished boots tapping on marble floors, their minds filled with maps, trade routes, and imperial ambition. Yet the people whose lands, lives, and futures were being divided were entirely absent. This silence would echo across generations, a wound inflicted at the very birth of colonialism's modern phase. For the European leaders, this absence was hardly a matter of concern. They operated within a worldview steeped in racial hierarchies and imperial logic, convinced that Africans were incapable of self-determination. To them, the civilizing mission justified the exclusion. The very act of partition was framed as an obligation, a duty to bring order, Christianity, and commerce to lands portrayed as chaotic and backward. In reality, it was a cold calculation. Fewer African voices meant fewer obstacles to plundering the continent's wealth. The result was a treaty signed without the consent of those most affected. Boundaries were drawn that bisected ethnic groups, disregarded centuries of trade networks, and ignored existing political structures. Rivers that had been lifelines for entire communities were reduced to boundary markers. Mountains that symbolized spiritual strength became arbitrary frontiers. The erasure of African agency at Berlin was as destructive as the imposition of colonial borders themselves. African leaders did attempt to engage. Long before Berlin, figures such as King Kama of the Bamangwato, Menelik II of Ethiopia, and the rulers of Asante had written letters, sent envoys, and sought alliances to protect their sovereignty. Yet in Berlin their appeals were brushed aside. The conference treated Africa as if it were a blank slate awaiting European design, despite its empires, kingdoms, and republics with centuries of governance and diplomacy. The silence at the table was not due to African absence of voice, but to European refusal to listen. The lack of representation had immediate consequences. Treaties signed under duress, or through misunderstanding, were taken as legitimate by the conference's standards. Chiefs who thought they were agreeing to trade rights found themselves bound in documents ceding sovereignty. Local leaders were framed as signatories, when in fact they had been manipulated, bribed, or deceived. These distortions became the scaffolding of empire, built on foundations of fraud. The moral implications were staggering. The principle of self-determination, which European nations fiercely defended for themselves, was denied wholesale to Africa. No effort was made to include African scholars, traders, or clergy who had long engaged with European counterparts. Even those educated in European traditions, fluent in languages and diplomacy, were not considered worthy of a seat. It was not ignorance that excluded Africa, but prejudice. The silence also meant that African perspectives on geography, culture, and history were ignored. European maps reduced Africa to empty spaces waiting to be claimed, yet these voids were filled with meaning for the people who lived there. The boundaries drawn in Berlin often placed hostile groups together while splitting unified peoples apart. Entire nations, such as the Somali or the U, were divided across colonial lines, sowing tensions that endure into the present. The absence of African voices ensured that the map of empire was also a map of future conflict. Some historians have argued that African representation might not have altered the outcome, given the overwhelming military and economic power of Europe. Yet this does not diminish the tragedy of their exclusion. Had African rulers been allowed to speak, their resistance might have slowed the tide or reshaped its course. At minimum, the record of history would bear their words alongside those of the imperialists. Instead, silence became their legacy. The contrast with other moments of global negotiation is striking. In the same century, Native American leaders signed treaties with the United States, however unequal. In Asia, Qing officials and Japanese diplomats confronted European powers directly. Africa, by contrast, was stripped even of the pretense of diplomacy. The continent's fate was discussed as though it were uninhabited, its people relegated to shadows. The silence was not passive, it was enforced. Missionaries who advocated for African autonomy were marginalized. Abolitionist voices who warned of new forms of slavery were dismissed. Even European critics of imperialism, such as members of socialist movements, were ignored. The conference was not a marketplace of ideas, but a fortress of consensus, determined to exclude dissent. The long-term impact of this silencing cannot be overstated. For decades, Africans were denied political agency. Their voices filtered through colonial administrators who claimed to speak for them. Resistance movements were often framed as rebellions rather than expressions of legitimate sovereignty. The absence of African representation in 1884 set the tone for an entire era in which African humanity was denied recognition on the world stage. Yet silence does not mean consent. In the decades following Berlin, Africans resisted in countless ways, through wars of independence, cultural preservation, and the slow, stubborn refusal to surrender identity. Their absence from the conference was a wound, but it also became a rallying point for later generations. When African leaders convened in the 20th century to demand independence, they carried with them the memory of 1884, when their ancestors had been silenced. The Berlin Conference, therefore, must be remembered not only as a geopolitical event, but as a moral catastrophe. It was a gathering where power silenced justice, where maps mattered more than people, and where the future was decided in the absence of those most entitled to shape it. The silence of Africa was not an oversight. It was the very mechanism by which empire was made. When the ink dried on the agreements of the Berlin Conference, Europe's conquest of Africa remained, for the moment, theoretical. Maps were redrawn in distant capitals, yet control on the ground still belonged to Africa's people. What transformed lines on paper into living empire was not merely willpower, but technology, an arsenal of tools that extended Europe's reach and shattered Africa's defenses. Guns, steamships, and telegraphs became the iron instruments of a new age, each one tilting the balance of power further in favor of the colonizers. Foremost among these tools was the gun. By the mid-19th century, European armies wielded rifles and machine guns that far outstripped the muskets and spears of African warriors. The Maxim gun, invented in 1884, the very year of the Berlin Conference, symbolized the new era. It could fire hundreds of rounds a minute, mowing down charging forces with mechanical indifference. African resistance, no matter how courageous, could not withstand such firepower for long. The battles of the late century, from the Anglo-Zulu War to the conquest of the Sudan, showcased this brutal imbalance. Courage met cold steel, and courage alone was no match. Yet guns alone did not deliver empire. Geography had long protected Africa from deeper European intrusion. Vast deserts, tangled forests, and rivers filled with rapids had checked explorers for centuries. That barrier collapsed with the rise of steam technology. Steamships could move upriver against currents that had once defied sail and oar. Vessels designed with shallow drafts penetrated waterways like the Congo and the Niger, carrying troops, missionaries, and traders deep into the interior. With each voyage, Africa's heartland became more accessible, its natural defenses less secure. Parallel to the spread of steamships was the laying of telegraph lines. Once established, they stitched colonial territories into networks of control, enabling governors and generals to communicate instantly with capitals thousands of miles away. A rebellion in East Africa could be reported in London within hours. Orders could travel from Paris to Dakar faster than a horse could gallop across a single village. The telegraph erased distance, allowing Europe to rule a continent by wire. To those who resisted, it meant their struggles were isolated. Colonial powers could coordinate reinforcements swiftly, crushing uprisings before they spread. Medical advances, too, formed part of the toolkit of empire. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, offered a measure of protection against malaria, the disease that had once been called the white man's grave. With quinine tablets in their kit, European soldiers and administrators could survive in areas once fatal to outsiders. Disease had been Africa's most powerful defense against invasion. Now, even that shield was weakened. Infrastructure projects magnified these tools further. Railways carved through terrain, carrying goods and soldiers alike, turning vast distances into manageable journeys. Ports expanded to handle the new demands of global commerce, while warehouses rose along coasts to store ivory, palm oil, rubber, and minerals extracted under colonial watch. Each mile of track and each stretch of telegraph wire bound Africa tighter to European economies, ensuring that the continent's wealth flowed outward rather than inward. The psychological impact of these tools was as devastating as their physical might. The thunder of machine guns instilled terror. The sight of steamships on once quiet rivers was a declaration of conquest. The metallic hum of telegraph lines reminded Africans that their occupiers commanded powers beyond imagination. Technology did not merely enforce empire, it legitimized it in European eyes. Colonial officials pointed to these inventions as proof of their superiority, claiming that modernity itself was on their side. Yet resistance did not vanish. African leaders adapted, sometimes acquiring firearms themselves, sometimes using guerrilla tactics to blunt the advantage of European armies. Menelik II of Ethiopia would famously procure modern weapons and defeat the Italians at Adwa in 1896, showing that technology could serve African independence when wielded shrewdly. Still, such victories were rare. More often, the tools of empire overwhelmed even the fiercest defenders. These technologies also reshaped the economics of conquest. Without steamships, vast inland regions might have remained beyond European reach. Without telegraphs, distant colonies would have been too costly to manage. Without modern guns, local uprisings could have threatened fragile garrisons. Together, they created the infrastructure of domination. The Berlin Conference may have granted legal cover, but it was the Maxim gun, the steamboat, and the telegraph wire that made colonization practical. Historians often describe this as the mechanization of conquest. What had once been wars of attrition became one-sided annihilations. What had once been journeys of exploration became carefully mapped supply routes. Europe had not only the will but the machinery to bend Africa into its empire. This was not fate, nor inevitability, but the consequence of choices made in laboratories, factories, and ministries far from the continent itself. The tools of empire thus became more than instruments of war. They were symbols of an age when human ingenuity was harnessed for domination rather than cooperation. They remind us of technology's dual nature, capable of healing or destroying, connecting or enslaving. In the story of Africa's partition, they played their darkest role. If the Berlin Conference represented the apportioning of a continent, and Europe's tools of empire supplied the means of enforcing that apportioning, Africa's people were not merely silent witnesses. From desert to savanna, from coastal kingdoms to deep forest societies, they resisted with ferocity, ingenuity, and sacrifice. The story of colonization is incomplete without acknowledging the voices that rose against it, the rebellions that flared like wildfires, the leaders who fought until their last breath, and the communities that refused to surrender their sovereignty without a fight. One of the earliest and most famous acts of resistance came from the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa. Though their struggle against the British predates the Berlin Conference, it set a template for how colonial expansion would be contested. In 1879, the Zulu inflicted a stunning defeat on British troops at the Battle of Isandlwana, demonstrating that courage, discipline, and knowledge of terrain could momentarily overcome European technology. Though ultimately crushed, the Zulu resistance revealed a truth that would echo across the continent. Empire was not uncontested, and colonization would exact a terrible cost in blood. Elsewhere, in West Africa, the Ashanti people fought repeated wars against the British. For decades, they defended their capital at Kumasi and their sacred golden stool, a symbol of unity and identity. Though British firepower and diplomacy eventually subdued them, the Ashanti Wars underscored the depth of attachment Africans felt to their sovereignty. To the Ashanti, resistance was not only political but spiritual, an obligation to ancestors and unborn generations alike. In East Africa, the Mahdiist uprising in Sudan demonstrated resistance on a scale that stunned European observers. Muhammad Ahmad, proclaiming himself the Mahdi, the Guided One, rallied tens of thousands against Egyptian and later British forces. At Khartoum in 1885, the Mahdiist army overwhelmed the garrison and killed General Charles Gordon, a moment that reverberated across Europe and forced Britain to reconsider its imperial designs. Though eventually defeated by Kitchener's army in 1898, the Mahdiist state endured for over a decade, a testament to Africa's capacity to organize sustained resistance under religious and nationalist banners. Religion frequently fueled these rebellions. Islam, deeply rooted in parts of West and East Africa, became both a rallying cry and a framework for resisting Christian missionary expansion and European domination. Movements like those of the Sokoto Caliphate in present-day Nigeria, though not immune to eventual conquest, embodied a defiance rooted in both faith and politics. Similarly, indigenous belief systems inspired resistance, with warriors often invoking ancestral spirits or drawing upon ritual power to sustain their fight. The Herero and Nama people of German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, provide one of the most harrowing examples. Between 1904 and 1908, they rose against German settlers and soldiers, only to face what many historians recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. Trapped in the desert, deprived of water, and hunted relentlessly, tens of thousands perished. The Herero resistance revealed both the determination of African communities and the extreme violence Europe was willing to unleash to suppress them. Not all resistance was military. In many regions, Africans engaged in subtle, everyday forms of defiance, evading colonial taxes, withholding labor, maintaining forbidden traditions, or mocking European authority through song and story. These acts, though less dramatic than open warfare, chipped away at colonial control and preserved cultural identity. They remind us that rebellion was not only fought on battlefields but also in households, fields, and marketplaces. The diversity of resistance is striking. Some leaders sought accommodation, negotiating treaties that bought time and space for their people. Others chose total war, preferring annihilation to subjugation. Menelik II of Ethiopia took a different path altogether. Through shrewd diplomacy and the purchase of modern weapons, he confronted the Italian invasion at Adwa in 1896 and achieved one of Africa's greatest victories. Ethiopia's survival as an independent nation stood as a beacon of hope for the entire continent, proof that resistance could succeed against seemingly insurmountable odds. The costs of these struggles were immense. Entire communities were uprooted, populations decimated, and cultural treasures destroyed. Yet without them, colonization might appear as a one-sided march of inevitability. Resistance restored balance to the narrative, revealing that Africa's story was not simply one of submission but of contest, negotiation, and sacrifice. Historians today increasingly emphasize these acts of defiance, not only to honor the memory of those who resisted, but also to challenge narratives that once painted colonization as a benevolent or unopposed process. Each rebellion tells us something profound about the human spirit, that even against overwhelming force, people will rise to defend what they hold sacred. The rebellions of Africa did not prevent colonization, but they left legacies that endured into the independence movements of the 20th century. Songs of fallen warriors became hymns of freedom. Memories of defiance nourished the dreams of later generations. In this way, resistance was not futile. It was foundational, a seed planted deep in the soil of history that would one day bloom again. Colonial conquest was not driven by curiosity alone, nor by the vague pursuit of prestige. At its core lay an insatiable hunger for wealth. Wealth in the form of gold, ivory, rubber, cotton, palm oil, diamonds, and above all, the untapped natural resources that lay beneath African soil. The Berlin Conference, cloaked in diplomatic language about trade freedom and humanitarian ideals, was in truth an economic charter. Each European power sought to carve out zones of extraction, to transform Africa into a reservoir of raw materials that would feed the furnaces, factories, and markets of an industrializing Europe. The Industrial Revolution had altered the very metabolism of European societies. Coal-fueled machines required cotton from the tropics, while the explosive growth of consumer industries demanded oils, dyes, and exotic products. Palm oil from West Africa greased the wheels of British machinery and later perfumed European households in the form of soaps. Ivory, once sacred in African cultures, was carved into piano keys, combs, and billiard balls in London, Paris, and Berlin. Rubber, tapped from vines and trees in the Congo, became indispensable to bicycle tires, telegraph wires, and the early automobile industry. Each resource was transformed into a commodity, detached from its origins, flowing inexorably into Europe's economic bloodstream. The Congo Free State, awarded to King Leopold II of Belgium at Berlin, became the most infamous laboratory of exploitation. Under Leopold's personal rule, Congolese villagers were compelled to meet rubber quotas enforced by brutal methods. Failure meant mutilation, the amputation of hands, or the torching of entire villages. Photographs of severed limbs circulated in Europe, exposing the lie of humanitarian imperialism. Reports from missionaries and travelers revealed that millions perished under Leopold's system, a genocide born not of ideology, but of economic greed. The Congo stands as a stark reminder that economic motives were not abstract. They were written in blood and bone. Other regions experienced similar fates. In South Africa, the discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in the 1860s and gold in the Witwatersrand in the 1880s triggered waves of settlement, conquest, and war. The British and the Boers clashed over these resources, reshaping the politics of the entire region. African labor was forced into the mines, often under conditions that amounted to industrial slavery. Dust, disease, and exploitation accompanied the sparkling gems that adorned European crowns and the gold that bolstered imperial treasuries. In West Africa, groundnuts, cocoa, and palm kernels became lucrative exports. Colonial regimes imposed taxes payable only in cash, forcing subsistence farmers into market production. The cycle of dependency was deliberate. Africa's economy was bent away from self-sufficiency and redirected toward Europe's needs. Railways and ports were constructed not to integrate African societies, but to funnel resources outward. The iron rails, gleaming in the sun, pointed invariably toward the coast, a reminder that colonial infrastructure was an artery of extraction. Resistance to this economic reordering was inevitable. In French West Africa, villagers fled into forests to avoid forced labor. In German East Africa, resentment against oppressive cotton cultivation contributed to the Maji-Maji Rebellion of 1905 to 1907. Warriors believed sacred water would turn bullets into water. Tragically, it did not, and tens of thousands died. Yet their uprising revealed how deeply the economic exploitation of colonization penetrated daily life, uprooting traditions and provoking desperate resistance. The human cost extended beyond violence. Economies that had once been diverse and resilient were transformed into monocultures vulnerable to global price fluctuations. Communities that had thrived on trade networks stretching across deserts and savannas found themselves strangled by colonial tariffs and taxes. Hunger and famine became recurring realities, not because Africa lacked abundance, but because imperial systems diverted it toward Europe. Europe justified these extractions through rhetoric of civilization and development. Colonial officials argued that railways, roads, and ports were gifts of modernity. But for Africans, these projects often meant conscription, taxation, and land alienation. Far from being symbols of progress, they were tools of dispossession. The wealth that flowed to Europe built palaces, museums, and universities. In Africa, it left scars. Still, Africa was not a passive victim. Communities adapted, resisted, and sometimes prospered within these new structures. African merchants exploited opportunities in export markets, and African farmers cultivated cash crops that afforded some independence. Yet the balance of power was always tilted, profits flowed upward, and wealth accumulated elsewhere. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe's appetite for African resources had permanently altered the continent's political and economic landscapes. The Berlin Conference had promised free trade, but what unfolded was economic servitude. The quest for resources was not incidental. It was the beating heart of the scramble for Africa. To understand this period is to grasp that empire was built less on flags and parades than on the quiet, relentless extraction of value from land and people. Behind every map line drawn in Berlin lay a calculation of profit, a vision of railways and ships ferrying Africa's wealth into European coffers. This was colonization not only of territory, but of economy, of the very rhythms of life. In this way, the scramble for Africa cannot be seen merely as a geopolitical event. It was also an economic revolution, one whose costs were borne disproportionately by those who had no seat at the Berlin table. The legacy of these exploitations endures, woven into the structural inequities that continue to shape Africa's global position today. If the quest for raw materials and markets provided the economic engine of imperial conquest, then missionaries furnished its moral mask. Across Europe, the rhetoric of colonization was not only about profits and prestige, but about civilizing missions. To many citizens of London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, the image of the missionary, Bible in one hand, torch of enlightenment in the other, justified the otherwise brutal realities of empire. Missionaries did not draw the maps at Berlin, but their presence offered the moral alibi for those who did. The 19th century was an era of evangelical fervor. Missionary societies multiplied in Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, dispatching thousands of men and women into the interior of Africa. Their stated purpose was salvation, to convert heathens to Christianity, to replace indigenous beliefs with European doctrine. Yet in practice, their work often intertwined with the expansion of empire. By teaching European languages, promoting Western education, and aligning with colonial authorities, missionaries smoothed the way for imperial governance. Schools became training grounds not just for Christian converts, but for colonial intermediaries. The Berlin Conference itself echoed missionary concerns. Official rhetoric frequently invoked the suppression of the slave trade and the spread of Christianity as noble goals. These appeals cloaked economic motives in a veil of philanthropy. King Leopold II, for instance, justified his claim over the Congo by presenting himself as a benefactor who would abolish slavery and bring spiritual light. His International African Association was couched in humanitarian language, while in reality, it became a vehicle for brutal exploitation. Missionary ideals thus became entangled with imperial propaganda. On the ground, the picture was more complex. Missionaries often lived in harsh conditions, building schools and churches from scratch, enduring disease, and witnessing violence. Some sincerely sought to defend Africans from colonial abuses. The British missionary Alice Seeley Harris became one of the most vocal critics of Belgian atrocities in the Congo, using her photographs of mutilated victims as evidence that shocked Europe. Missionaries like David Livingstone combined evangelism with exploration, bringing back accounts that stirred public interest in Africa. Their writings painted the continent as both a land of spiritual opportunity and a field ripe for European expansion. But missionaries were not neutral. In many regions, they undermined indigenous religions, dismissing them as primitive or demonic. Sacred groves were felled, ancestral practices were suppressed, and African cosmologies were delegitimized. Conversion was often accompanied by cultural erasure. Traditional healers, elders, and spiritual leaders lost authority as churches assumed power. Colonial authorities recognized this shift and encouraged missionary expansion, for it weakened local structures of resistance. Education was one of the most enduring legacies of missionary work. Literacy, often taught for the purpose of Bible reading, empowered Africans in unexpected ways. Mission-educated elites became clerks, translators, and political leaders. Many of the future leaders of African independence movements, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Leopold Senghor of Senegal, were educated in missionary schools. The same classrooms that instilled Christian obedience also sparked the intellectual tools for anti-colonial critique. Here lay the paradox of the missionary project. While intended to domesticate, it also planted the seeds of resistance. Tensions often arose between missionaries and colonial authorities. While they shared a common ideology of civilization, missionaries sometimes condemned excessive violence or corruption. Their appeals to Christian morality occasionally embarrassed imperial powers. Reports of forced labor, famine, and massacres filtered back to Europe through missionary correspondence, fueling reform campaigns. Yet these voices were never sufficient to overturn the economic imperatives of empire. They provided a humanitarian critique, but rarely a revolutionary one. Missionary presence also altered African social dynamics. Converts often gained privileges, education, or access to trade, creating divisions within communities. Families split along lines of faith, and traditional leaders saw their authority challenged. Christianity spread unevenly, flourishing in some areas while faltering in others. It fused with local traditions, producing syncretic forms of worship that blended African and European elements. In this way, Christianity was not merely imposed. It was adapted, resisted, and reinterpreted. Despite these complexities, the overarching reality remained. Missionary work was a powerful instrument of cultural transformation. It provided the ideological framework that made empire palatable to European publics. The brutal extraction of resources, the forced labor, and the territorial conquests could be rationalized as regrettable but necessary steps in a higher mission of salvation. This civilizing narrative endured long after the Berlin Conference, shaping colonial policy for decades. By the turn of the 20th century, Africa's religious landscape had been permanently altered. Churches dotted landscapes once dominated by shrines and ancestral groves. Hymns in local languages rose alongside the sound of church bells, echoing across lands where indigenous prayers had long been spoken. The missionary legacy was double-edged. It offered literacy and global connection, but at the cost of profound cultural loss. Thus, the moral mask of empire was secured. Behind the language of salvation lay economic exploitation. Behind the hymnals lay gunboats. Missionaries became both agents of transformation and witnesses to atrocity. their work woven into the tangled fabric of colonization. Their story cannot be told apart from the scramble for Africa, for they gave empire its conscience, however compromised, and left behind a spiritual inheritance that continues to shape Africa today. The scramble for Africa was not merely a matter of ink on maps and speeches in European capitals. It was lived in blood, fire, and chains. For the peoples of Africa, the partition of their lands translated into violent conquest, dispossession, and resistance. The story of the Berlin Conference cannot be told without reckoning with the human cost of the lines drawn across the continent and the struggles of those who refused to bow to imperial power. In the decades following 1884, European powers rushed to transform paper claims into territorial control. Explorers and administrators were followed by armies and armed companies. Resistance was inevitable. Across the continent, Africans confronted the intrusion of foreign authority with defiance, drawing on long traditions of independence, warfare, and diplomacy. Yet the asymmetry of power was stark. Industrial age weapons, machine guns, repeating rifles, artillery, met spears, swords, and muskets. The outcome was often predetermined, but the resistance was no less fierce. One of the most famous examples was the Zulu resistance in southern Africa. After the Berlin Conference, British imperial ambition continued to expand, but the Zulu kingdom remained a formidable force. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, slightly preceding the conference, foreshadowed the violence of the coming decades. At the Battle of Isandlwana, Zulu warriors annihilated a British column, shocking Europe. Yet within months, superior British firepower crushed their kingdom. The pattern repeated across the continent. Moments of indigenous triumph followed by devastating imperial reprisals. In the Sudan, the Mahdiist revolt erupted in 1881, a movement fusing religion and resistance. The Mahdi's forces routed Egyptian and British armies, seizing Khartoum in 1885 and killing General Charles Gordon. For a time, the Mahdiist state stood as a defiant challenge to imperial encroachment. But by 1898, the combined British-Egyptian army under General Kitchener unleashed the full force of modern warfare at Omdurman. Tens of thousands of Sudanese were cut down in hours by Maxim guns, a chilling demonstration of the technological imbalance of empire. The Herero and Nama peoples of German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, endured one of the most brutal chapters of colonial conquest. When they rebelled in 1904 against German expropriation and cruelty, the German Empire responded with genocidal fury. General Lothar von Trotha issued an extermination order, driving entire populations into the desert, cutting off water sources, and erecting concentration camps. By 1908, as much as 80% of the Herero population and half of the Nama had perished. This was not merely conquest. It was annihilation, a crime that foreshadowed horrors of the 20th century. French conquest in West Africa followed a similarly bloody trajectory. Leaders like Samori Touré of the Wassoulou Empire mounted protracted resistance, using both diplomacy and guerrilla tactics. For nearly 2 decades, Samori evaded French advances, relocating his capital and forging alliances. But relentless French pressure and superior weaponry eventually broke his empire. Likewise, the Ashanti in present-day Ghana waged multiple wars against the British before succumbing to colonial rule. These struggles reveal that Africa's partition was never uncontested. It was resisted at immense human cost. The Berlin Conference's legacy was also felt in the arbitrary borders it imposed. Ethnic groups were split across colonies. Rival communities were forced into the same political entities. This sowed seeds of division that would haunt the continent for generations. Communities that had once negotiated fluid boundaries found themselves policed by European lines, with armed patrols enforcing new realities. Violence was not only physical but structural, embedding inequality into the very geography of Africa. Beyond the battlefield, resistance took many forms. Some African rulers attempted negotiation, leveraging European rivalries to maintain autonomy. The Kingdom of Ethiopia, under Emperor Menelik II, skillfully played Italians, French, and British against each other. When Italy sought to impose a protectorate, Ethiopia refused and met the Italians on the battlefield at Adwa in 1896. In a stunning reversal, Ethiopian forces crushed the Italian army, securing Ethiopia's sovereignty and inspiring anti-colonial movements across Africa. Adwa remains a symbol of defiance, a reminder that empire was not omnipotent. Cultural resistance also endured. Songs, oral histories, and religious practices preserved memory and identity amid conquest. Movements like the Maji Maji Rebellion in German East Africa, 1905 to 1907, wove spiritual belief into resistance, with warriors convinced that sacred water would protect them from bullets. Though ultimately crushed with mass slaughter, the rebellion reflected the fusion of indigenous cosmology and political struggle. Resistance, in all its forms, revealed a continent unwilling to be quietly subdued. The violence of partition scarred Africa deeply. Millions were killed, displaced, or enslaved anew under systems of forced labor. Land was seized for European settlers, mines, and plantations. African bodies became the fuel for imperial profit, their sweat and blood underwriting the luxuries of Europe. Yet within this grim reality, the resilience of African resistance stands as a testament to the will to survive. The cost of partition was immense. Entire societies were dismantled, their economies reshaped to serve distant capitals. Cultural traditions were suppressed, and political structures erased. But the legacy of resistance endured. From the ashes of these struggles emerged a memory of defiance that would later inspire independence movements in the 20th century. The violence of the Scramble was not the end of African agency. It was a brutal chapter in a longer story of survival and eventual liberation. In the corridors of the Berlin Conference, while diplomats drank fine wines and spoke of civilization, one man maneuvered more shrewdly than all the rest: King Leopold II of Belgium. His nation was small, his armies limited, yet he dreamed of an empire vast enough to rival those of Britain and France. By disguising his ambitions under the cloak of humanitarianism, Leopold secured international recognition for what would become one of the darkest chapters in colonial history: the Congo Free State. Leopold presented himself as a benefactor of Africa. He declared that his International African Association would combat the Arab slave trade, promote Christianity, and bring commerce to the Congo Basin. European diplomats, eager to balance power and maintain free trade along the Congo River, accepted his proposal. In 1885, the Berlin Conference recognized the Congo Free State, not as a Belgian colony, but as the personal possession of Leopold himself. An empire carved out not for a nation, but for a single man. Behind the rhetoric of philanthropy, the Congo became a nightmare of exploitation. Its forests and rivers concealed immense wealth, first ivory, then rubber. Leopold's administration transformed the land into a vast labor camp. Villages were forced to meet impossible quotas of rubber collection. Refusal or failure brought swift punishment. Soldiers of the force public, the brutal colonial army, enforced quotas through terror. They took hostages, burned villages, and mutilated resistors. Severed hands became the grim accounting system of conquest, proof that bullets had not been wasted. Reports of atrocities began to filter out through missionaries, travelers, and Africans who escaped the system. They spoke of men whipped to death with the chikad, a whip made of hippopotamus hide. They told of women and children held hostage until their men brought in rubber. They described forests haunted by silence, villages emptied of life, rivers carrying corpses downstream. The Congo Free State was not free, it was a kingdom of fear. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that between 1885 and 1908, the population of the Congo may have been reduced by as much as half. Millions of lives extinguished through murder, famine, disease, and despair. Whole communities vanished, their languages silenced, their traditions erased. This was not the incidental brutality of conquest. It was systematic plunder on an industrial scale. Yet even in this crucible of suffering, resistance flared. Villagers fled into forests, ambushed patrols, and sabotaged transport routes. Leaders like Nsala of Walla became symbols of defiance, his image, photographed by missionaries, showing him staring at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. The photograph traveled the world, igniting outrage and breaking the carefully crafted image of Leopold's benevolence. International protest grew louder as evidence mounted. Missionaries such as William Shepherd and activists like Edie Morel and Roger Casement exposed the horrors of Leopold's regime. Morel, a shipping clerk, noticed that vessels carried weapons and chains into the Congo, but returned laden with ivory and rubber, never goods that might indicate real trade. Casement's official report in 1904, commissioned by the British government, confirmed the scale of atrocity. The Congo Reform Association became one of the first international human rights campaigns, mobilizing public opinion across Europe and America. Leopold, pressured by scandal, tried to disguise his role. He funded lavish public works in Belgium with the wealth of the Congo, erecting monuments and museums that still stand today. But his reputation darkened irreparably as evidence of crime spread. By 1908, international condemnation forced Leopold to relinquish control. The Belgian state annexed the Congo, ending the Free State, but continuing colonial exploitation under a different name. The legacy of the Congo Free State is one of the most haunting reminders of what the scramble for Africa unleashed. Here, the rhetoric of civilization cloaked mass murder. Here, the greed of one monarch tore apart the lives of millions. Here, the global conscience began to stir, recognizing that empire carried a moral price that could no longer be hidden. The Congo became a mirror for Europe, reflecting not its ideals but its hypocrisies. While diplomats in Berlin spoke of progress, the reality was mutilation and despair. While philanthropists preached about ending slavery, a new slavery thrived in the heart of Africa. The Congo Free State was the starkest proof that the scramble for Africa was not a humanitarian enterprise, but a ravenous feeding on land, labor, and life. Even today, the shadows of Leopold's Congo remain. Communities still carry the memory of villages destroyed, traditions lost, and ancestors slaughtered. The scars of exploitation shaped the trajectory of Central Africa, leaving legacies of instability and trauma. The story of the Congo Free State is not merely a footnote to the Berlin Conference. It is its most damning indictment, a testament to what happens when ambition is unchecked by conscience. The scramble for Africa was not presented to the world as naked conquest, though conquest was at its core. Instead, it was wrapped in a shroud of lofty language, carried on the shoulders of myths, and sanctified by the voices of missionaries. In salons, parliaments, and churches across Europe, the rhetoric was the same. Colonization was not simply about power, it was about saving souls, uplifting humanity, and spreading civilization. This civilizing mission, born from centuries of religious expansion and Enlightenment arrogance, became one of the most effective justifications for empire. Christian missionaries had long ventured into Africa, predating the Berlin Conference by centuries. Portuguese friars followed caravans along the West African coast in the 15th century. Jesuits labored in Angola. By the 19th century, Protestant and Catholic missions multiplied, from the London Missionary Society in southern Africa to Catholic missions in the Congo. They carried Bibles, hymnals, and a conviction that Africa was a continent of darkness awaiting spiritual light. Missionaries often wrote of themselves as soldiers of faith in hostile lands, battling disease, superstition, and what they perceived as moral decay. This narrative dovetailed perfectly with imperial ambitions. European powers could frame their expansion not as robbery, but as redemption. Maps depicted Africa as a blank canvas, its people voiceless, awaiting Western instruction. The myth of the Dark Continent flourished in popular culture through adventure novels, travelogues, and exhibitions. Africa was portrayed as savage, dangerous, and mysterious, a place where European bravery and virtue could prove themselves. It was a powerful myth, and one that erased the histories, cultures, and civilizations already thriving across the continent. Missionaries themselves were not a monolith. Some worked tirelessly to protect African communities from the worst abuses of colonial exploitation. Others, knowingly or unknowingly, became the vanguard of conquest, their missions serving as footholds for European control. They introduced new systems of education and literacy, often replacing indigenous traditions with Western models. They translated languages into written form, but at the same time condemned oral traditions as primitive. They baptized thousands, while also dismantling ancestral rituals. The civilizing mission was both a bridge and a bulldozer. The language of morality became a mask for exploitation. Colonial officials used missionary presence as evidence of their benevolence. "We are here not to plunder, but to uplift," they declared, as soldiers enforced labor quotas and companies drained resources. The Berlin Conference even enshrined the principle of moral obligation into its acts, requiring powers to protect the spiritual and material welfare of Africans. Yet in practice, rubber quotas and tax systems mattered more than sermons. The Bible and the bullet marched together. At the same time, missionary accounts provided Europe with its most intimate window into Africa. Letters and journals described daily life, health crises, and the brutality of local colonial administrators. Some missionaries, horrified by what they witnessed, became whistleblowers. It was missionaries in the Congo who first reported the atrocities of Leopold's regime. Their credibility as men of faith lent moral weight to reform movements in Europe, exposing hypocrisies that politicians preferred to ignore. In this sense, the missionary was both an agent of empire and, paradoxically, one of its critics. The myths of the civilizing mission spread beyond religion. Anthropologists, explorers, and politicians wove together a worldview in which Africa was permanently childlike, incapable of progress without European guidance. School children in Europe learned that their empires were benevolent, carrying medicine, law, and knowledge to a continent sunk in darkness. Cartoons depicted Africans as caricatures, wide-eyed, naive, often infantilized. The moral economy of empire depended on these images, convincing ordinary citizens that empire was not theft but duty. Yet African voices did not remain silent. Converts sometimes used the language of Christianity to critique colonialism, arguing that the true message of the gospel was freedom and justice, not subjugation. Educated Africans, trained in missionary schools, became leaders of later independence movements. Their literacy and rhetorical skill allowed them to challenge empire on its own terms. The seeds of decolonization were, ironically, sown in the classrooms of missionaries who sought to reshape African minds. The civilizing mission also intersected with gender. European women, barred from formal politics, often found purpose in missionary societies, raising funds and supporting schools for African girls. They saw themselves as mothers to a continent, uplifting womanhood and reshaping families. Yet these efforts, too, came with assumptions of superiority, imposing Western ideals of femininity and domestic life onto societies with their own rich traditions. The myth endured because it was comforting. To believe that empire was benevolence rather than brutality made the scramble for Africa palatable to European consciences. To believe that missionary work was salvation rather than cultural destruction allowed parliaments to fund conquest with public support. The civilizing mission was not simply propaganda. It was a worldview, deeply internalized, shaping how generations of Europeans understood Africa and their place within it. Looking back, the civilizing mission reveals the tragic contradictions of the scramble. The same schools that dismantled traditions also nurtured future leaders of resistance. The same Bibles that justified conquest also offered a language of liberation. The same myths that erased African agency eventually faced challenge by the very people they sought to silence. History shows that myths, no matter how powerful, cannot forever conceal reality. The Berlin Conference carved Africa into neat shapes on a European map, but those lines could never erase the will of its people. Across the continent, Africans did not quietly accept the theft of their land, resources, and sovereignty. They resisted, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through rebellion, sometimes through the stubborn endurance of culture and faith. Their voices, though often silenced in the annals of imperial propaganda, remind us that colonization was never uncontested. From the outset, African leaders tried negotiation. Many rulers, faced with the sudden arrival of treaties from European agents, sought to balance survival with sovereignty. Menelik II of Ethiopia famously turned European rivalries to his advantage, purchasing arms and playing Italy, France, and Britain against one another. His foresight culminated in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Ethiopian forces crushed an invading Italian army, securing Ethiopia's place as the only African state to remain free from colonial subjugation during the Scramble. Menelik's triumph became a symbol of hope across the continent, proof that African armies could stand against Europe's might. Other rulers attempted to protect their people through agreements that were often misunderstood or deliberately mistranslated. Chiefs signed documents thinking they had secured trade alliances or mutual protection, only to discover later that the text ceded full sovereignty to colonial powers. In the Gold Coast in Nigeria, British officials used treaties of protection to dismantle political autonomy. Leaders who resisted faced swift military punishment. Yet the very act of signing or refusing treaties was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to allow Europe the illusion of legitimacy without African involvement. Where diplomacy failed, open rebellion flared. In West Africa, Samori Touré led a determined resistance against French expansion, building a disciplined army armed with modern rifles and using guerrilla tactics across the savannah. For over a decade, he kept French forces at bay, demonstrating extraordinary resilience before finally being captured in 1898. His struggle echoed through West African memory, a tale of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom under leaders like Cetshwayo and later Dinuzulu clashed with both British and Boer settlers. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, just prior to the Berlin Conference, revealed the determination of African states to defend their independence. The Zulu victory at Isandlwana shocked the British Empire, showing that European armies were not invincible. Although eventually subdued, the Zulu struggle remained a defining moment of African resistance. The spirit of defiance spread beyond the battlefield. In German East Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907, erupted when colonial authorities imposed brutal labor regimes for cotton cultivation. Leaders drew upon spiritual traditions, distributing Maji, sacred water, believed to protect warriors from bullets. Though tragically crushed, the rebellion united dozens of ethnic groups in a rare coalition, demonstrating how colonial oppression could spark collective identity across traditional divides. Resistance also took quieter forms. Communities fled into remote regions to avoid taxation or forced labor. Farmers sabotaged colonial crops, feigning ignorance of European demands. Traditional healers and religious leaders preserved rituals outlawed by missionaries, sustaining cultural continuity in the face of suppression. These acts of everyday resistance, though less visible than battles, eroded the total control colonial authorities sought to impose. Women played a vital role in resistance. In Nigeria, women organized protests against unfair taxation, famously in the ABA Women's Riot of 1929, where thousands marched, chanted, and demanded justice. Earlier, in Sierra Leone and Ghana, market women boycotted colonial goods, asserting economic power. African women's resistance was not confined to the domestic sphere. They stood at the forefront of communal survival. African intellectuals, often products of missionary education, became another voice of resistance. Figures such as Edward Blyden, a Liberian scholar, challenged European racial theories by emphasizing the dignity and richness of African culture. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches began to circulate in colonial cities, offering critique and satire of European rule. These voices planted seeds that would later grow into nationalist movements of the 20th century. Despite these efforts, most rebellions ended in tragedy. European powers wielded machine guns, railroads, and gunboats, technologies that tipped the balance. Entire communities were massacred, villages burned, and populations forced into submission. Yet the memory of resistance endured. Oral traditions preserve the stories of warriors and kings who fought against impossible odds. Songs carried the names of leaders like Touré, Cetshwayo, and Menelik, ensuring they would not be forgotten. The narrative of Africa as passive victim collapses under the weight of these histories. Africans were actors, strategists, and visionaries who faced the storm of imperialism with remarkable courage. They lost battles, but they also left legacies of defiance that would inspire later generations. When the winds of decolonization swept across the continent in the mid-20th century, those memories of resistance provided a foundation for renewed struggles for freedom. What becomes clear is that the scramble for Africa was never complete. The map may have been redrawn in Berlin, but on the ground, the story was contested at every step. Colonizers sought to impose order, but Africans disrupted, adapted, and endured. Their rebellions were not failures. They were sparks, reminders that human dignity does not yield quietly to domination. The scramble for Africa was not merely about colored lines on a European map. It was about wealth. Beneath the surface of treaties and protectorates lay the true motivation: extraction. Africa was to be Europe's inexhaustible treasure chest, its soils tilled for crops that fed distant cities, its mines carved open for metals and gems that built empires, and its people forced into systems of labor that mirrored enslavement in everything but name. The economic chains forged during the partition of Africa shackled the continent's future for generations. Before Berlin, Africa's trade with Europe had centered on palm oil, ivory, gold, and the remnants of the slave trade. After Berlin, the dynamic shifted. Colonial powers imposed economies designed not for African prosperity, but for imperial consumption. Crops that once sustained local communities were replaced by cash crops: cotton, cocoa, groundnuts, and coffee, destined for European markets. Entire regions were transformed into monoculture zones. In the Gold Coast, cocoa plantations spread rapidly, enriching a few African entrepreneurs but leaving most farmers tethered to volatile global prices. In Egypt and Sudan, cotton fields expanded to serve the hungry mills of Lancashire. In German East Africa, cotton was cultivated under forced labor, igniting the Maji-Maji uprising. The exploitation of minerals was even more dramatic. The Congo, under King Leopold II's brutal personal rule, became synonymous with plunder. Leopold's agents imposed quotas for rubber collection, punishing those who failed with whippings, amputations, and massacres. Villages were burned, populations decimated, and forests ravaged to satisfy the demands of the European bicycle and automobile industries. Reports of severed hands shocked international audiences, yet the profits flowing to Brussels and Leopold's private accounts silenced many critics. It was the dark arithmetic of empire. Human suffering transmuted into wealth. Further south, the discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886 transformed southern Africa into one of the richest mining zones on Earth. British magnates like Cecil Rhodes and financiers in London grew rich, while African workers were conscripted into mines under harsh conditions, confined to compounds, and paid meager wages. The wealth extracted funded railroads, mansions, and European luxuries, but in the mining pits, men died from accidents, silicosis, and exhaustion. Their labor built empires, yet they remained voiceless in the economies they sustained. Colonial taxation systems ensured compliance. Europeans imposed hut taxes, head taxes, and labor taxes, payable only in colonial currency. To obtain this currency, Africans were forced into wage labor in mines, plantations, and infrastructure projects. The colonial state thus converted freedom into debt, binding communities to the economy of empire. Roads and railroads, often celebrated as symbols of progress, were constructed not to connect African communities to one another, but to funnel raw materials from the interior to coastal ports for export. Infrastructure became the arteries of extraction, pulsing outward toward Europe rather than inward toward Africa's own needs. The brutality of this economic order was compounded by famine. In many regions, land previously devoted to subsistence crops was commandeered for cash crops, leaving populations vulnerable when harvests failed. In German East Africa during the Rinderpest epidemic of the 1890s, cattle herds were wiped out, and colonial policies exacerbated famine, reducing millions to starvation. In India under British rule, similar policies produced catastrophic famines. In Africa, they repeated the same pattern. Hunger became another tool of domination. Even where Africans participated in the colonial economy as traders, intermediaries, or small-scale entrepreneurs, their autonomy was precarious. European firms monopolized shipping, insurance, and credit. Colonial authorities restricted African traders from competing with European companies, ensuring that wealth flowed upward into imperial coffers. A few families prospered, but the vast majority were confined to subsistence or exploited labor. This economic exploitation extended to culture and labor itself. The imposition of European schools and missions often came hand in hand with labor discipline. Education was designed less to empower Africans than to create a clerical class to serve the colonial machine. Mission schools taught obedience and industriousness, preparing Africans for roles as clerks, teachers, or minor administrators, positions that sustained the colonial state rather than challenged it. The chains of extraction were not only physical, but psychological. Colonial propaganda portrayed Africa as a continent without history, waiting for Europe's guidance to unlock its wealth. This narrative obscured centuries of African commerce and innovation, from the gold trade of Mali to the trading cities of the Swahili coast. By denying Africa's economic past, colonizers justified their theft of its future. Resistance to this system was constant. Strikes by miners, boycotts by market women, and rebellions against forced labor punctuated the colonial period. Yet the imbalance of power ensured that resistance was often crushed with violence. The echoes of this exploitation reverberate into the present. Nations that were forced into monocultures struggled after independence to diversify their economies. Infrastructure designed for extraction left countries connected outward but fragmented inward. The profits of Africa's wealth fueled European industrialization, while Africa itself was left impoverished. The Berlin Conference did not create these systems, but it legitimized and accelerated them. By sanctioning imperial partition, it gave European powers the moral and legal cover to exploit Africa with impunity. The conference was a boardroom meeting for empire, and Africa became the ledger upon which profits were calculated. The cost, however, was borne by millions of African men, women, and children, whose labor and land enriched distant capitals. The story of economic chains is not only one of theft, but of resilience. Despite the plunder, Africans adapted, resisted, and preserved cultural practices that outlasted colonial economies. They survived famines, rebuilt communities, and carried forward traditions that would later inspire the independence movements of the 20th century. Yet the scars remain, scars carved into landscapes, economies, and collective memory. The scramble for Africa was, at its core, an economic conquest disguised as civilizing mission. Its chains were not made of iron but of debt, taxes, and enforced labor, yet they bound as tightly as any shackles. And in those chains lay the paradox of empire. Europe's industrial ascendancy was built on Africa's enforced underdevelopment. When the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 adjourned, its delegates congratulated themselves on their civilized accomplishment. With maps covered in ink and signatures drying on treaties, the men who had never set foot in much of Africa believed they had created order. In reality, they had created fault lines that would fracture a continent for centuries. The borders drawn in Berlin were not boundaries of culture, language, or community. They were arbitrary lines that cut across rivers, deserts, forests, and human lives. The legacy of those lines is one of Africa's deepest and most enduring wounds. To understand the consequences, one must first grasp the scale of the partition. Before 1884, Africa was a mosaic of kingdoms, emirates, chiefdoms, and stateless societies, each with fluid borders shaped by trade, war, and migration. The Berlin Conference shattered this mosaic. Within 3 decades, almost 90% of the continent was claimed by European powers. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained officially independent, though even they faced immense pressure from imperial encroachment. The new boundaries often forced together groups with little in common or separated peoples with deep cultural ties. The Somali people were divided among 5 colonial administrations: British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, Ethiopia, and Kenya. The U of West Africa found themselves split between British-controlled Gold Coast and German Togoland. Arbitrary divisions bred tensions that simmered long after independence, sometimes erupting into secessionist wars, civil conflicts, and decades of instability. Colonial powers intentionally ignored African social realities. They drew straight lines through the Sahara, partitioned kingdoms like Buganda and Ashanti, and dissected trade networks that had thrived for centuries. The overriding priority was not governance, but access. access to coasts, to rivers, to fertile land, and above all to resources. Railways, ports, and military garrisons followed these artificial boundaries, embedding them into Africa's political geography. The impact extended beyond the map. The very concept of the nation-state, imported from Europe, clashed with Africa's more fluid notions of sovereignty and community. In Europe, borders were sanctified by wars of consolidation and centuries of shared identity. In Africa, they were imposed overnight, without consultation, creating states that lacked cohesion. At independence, African leaders faced the monumental challenge of forging national identities from colonial creations. The Organization of African Unity, formed in 1963, chose to maintain colonial borders to prevent endless disputes. This pragmatic decision preserved peace in some cases, but also enshrined the injustices of Berlin. Nations were locked into shapes that did not reflect their people, making unity difficult and secessionist movements inevitable. Biafra in Nigeria, Katanga in Congo, Eritrea in Ethiopia, all were born of Berlin's cartographic violence. Economic consequences followed. Landlocked countries such as Mali, Niger, and Chad were cut off from the sea, dependent on neighbors for trade. Regions rich in resources, like Katanga or Cabinda, became contested zones within larger states, fueling conflict. Infrastructure built by colonial powers reinforced fragmentation. Railways ran from mines to ports, bypassing hinterlands, leaving states internally disconnected. The psychological legacy was equally profound. Borders became symbols of exclusion, barriers where none had existed before. Families were split, nomadic routes disrupted, cultural exchanges stifled. The Berlin Conference taught Africans that their lives could be divided and rearranged by distant strangers. This lesson fostered distrust in government structures, seen not as representatives of the people, but as enforcers of arbitrary authority. Yet amidst these scars, Africans forged resilience. Nationalist leaders, from Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana to Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, attempted to transform artificial borders into frameworks for unity. They preached Pan-Africanism, urging citizens to see beyond imposed lines and embrace continental solidarity. Their vision was to undo, at least spiritually, the damage inflicted by Berlin. Still, the conflicts born of partition endure. Rwanda's genocide, Sudan's secession, and the instability in the Sahel all carry echoes of colonial boundaries. Scholars debate whether Africa's future lies in strengthening nation-states or creating more regional integration. Either path requires confronting the ghost of Berlin, still visible in every map of Africa today. The borders, however, do not tell the whole story. While they represent division, the survival of African cultures across those divisions testifies to resilience. Despite being split among multiple states, the Yoruba, Hausa, and Zulu maintained languages, traditions, and identities. Trade, migration, and kinship adapted to new realities, demonstrating that communities could persist even when the map denied them. The legacy of partition, then, is paradoxical. It is a story of harm, but also of endurance, of fracture, but also of survival. Berlin imposed borders that were not Africa's, yet Africans have continuously resisted, redefined, and lived beyond them. In markets that cross frontiers, in music that transcends borders, and in political movements that dream of continental unity, Africa quietly undermines the lines imposed in 1884. The scramble for Africa ended on paper, but its consequences remain written into the soil, the rivers, and the lives of millions. The men at Berlin thought they had ended chaos. Instead, they began a legacy of partition whose reverberations will shape Africa and the world for generations to come. The story of the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa is not a tale confined to the dusty margins of 19th century diplomacy. Its echoes still shape the modern world, reverberating in wars, economies, migrations, and the deep scars etched into African societies. What took place in that gilded Berlin Hall in 1884 was not simply a meeting of statesmen, but the birth of an enduring system of dispossession. Borders were carved like wounds, and the consequences have never fully healed. At its heart, the scramble for Africa was a triumph of greed over humanity. It showcased how men who considered themselves guardians of civilization could in the same breath deny the very humanity of millions. They spoke of order, commerce, and progress, yet the ink of their treaties was mixed with blood. Africa was not invited to its own partition, its voices silenced, its sovereignty ignored. What emerged was a continent disassembled like a puzzle and reassembled in shapes that defied logic, history, or compassion. And yet, amid this grim inheritance, one finds not only tragedy but resilience. The very act of survival by African peoples, maintaining languages, reasserting cultures, reclaiming history, stands as defiance against Berlin. The borders that were meant to divide have not extinguished the pulse of solidarity. Across arbitrary frontiers, kinship endures, music and trade flow, and identities adapt. The story of the Scramble is thus not only of loss but of endurance, a reminder that the human spirit bends but does not always break. The modern political map of Africa remains the most visible ghost of Berlin. Each straight line and jagged frontier testifies to decisions made in European capitals rather than African villages. Civil wars, secessionist movements, and fragile national identities are often traced back to that moment when cartographers replaced communities with coordinates. Yet to reduce Africa's struggles solely to Berlin is to deny African agency. Over the last century, leaders, thinkers, and ordinary citizens have sought ways to transcend the partition, whether through Pan-African dreams, regional alliances, or grassroots solidarity that refuses to be confined by lines on a page. The lessons of Berlin extend beyond Africa. They remind humanity of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of power exercised without empathy, of decisions made in ivory towers that ripple across generations. The Scramble is not merely African history, it is world history. It shaped global trade, enriched European empires, and set precedents for how might was dressed as right. Its consequences are written into the very fabric of globalization, into migration patterns, into the wealth disparities between continents. In remembering Berlin, we are invited to reflect on what justice might mean in the shadow of empire. Can reparations heal? Can regional integration soften the fractures of partition? Can memory itself be a form of resistance, ensuring that the arrogance of 1884 is never repeated? There are no simple answers. But history, if nothing else, urges us to recognize the humanity that the men of Berlin denied. The ghost of Berlin lingers not as an immutable curse, but as a warning. It reminds us that the decisions of the powerful can outlive their lifetimes, shaping destinies far beyond what they imagined. It also reminds us of the courage of those who endured, of peoples who, despite division, held fast to identity and dignity. Africa's story since 1884 is not solely one of victimhood, but of reclamation, creativity, and struggle. In the end, the Berlin Conference stands as a mirror held up to humanity. A reflection of what happens when arrogance eclipses empathy, when maps are drawn without listening to the voices of those who must live within them. Its legacy is painful, but it is also instructive. To study it is to confront the darkness of history, and to hope that in doing so, we may choose a more just and humane path in the future.